Billionaire calls a black waitress unqualified, then sees the name on her necklace. Life-changing. She had survived nursing school, night shifts, and losing everything in a hospital budget cut. Now, she was refilling coffee in a luxury restaurant, invisible to the powerful people she served. To them, she was just another black waitress, till a billionaire glanced at her name necklace, smirked, and publicly dismissed her as unqualified for anything better. But when his eyes returned to that tiny piece of gold on her chest, his face changed. The room went silent, because that name, he knew it, and it could destroy him. Before that night, her life was a quiet grind, held together by sheer stubbornness. Her name was Alana, a registered nurse who had once walked hospital halls with purpose and pride. She had worked through double shifts, exam stress, and the constant need to prove she belonged in a field where patients sometimes asked for someone else the moment they saw her dark skin. Then came the cuts, a faceless decision in a glass office miles away. Her unit was shut down, positions eliminated, lives appended including hers. Now she carried plates instead of charts, moving through a glossy downtown restaurant where the chandeliers sparkled over people who made the kinds of decisions that had taken everything from her. To them, she was just part of the scenery, polite, efficient, forgettable. The only thing that still felt like hers was the thin gold necklace resting against her collarbone, letters spelling out her full name. It was a gift from her mother, given on the day Alana graduated nursing school. Her mother had said that one day, that name would open doors. Lately, it felt like it only reminded her of the ones that had closed. Still, she pushed forward, saving tips in an envelope behind her dresser, studying for certification exams during bus rides, promising herself this job was temporary. That evening began like any other, the familiar mix of exhaustion, forced smiles, and aching feet. But in the kitchen, the staff whispered about a high-profile guest, a billionaire who had just orchestrated one of the biggest healthcare restructurings in the state. Alana barely looked up from her order pad. She had no idea that the man responsible for shattering her career was already on his way and that before the night ended, he would be staring at the name on her necklace, unable to escape what he had done. From the moment the billionaire's reservation appeared on the screen, the restaurant changed. The manager's voice grew sharper, shoulders straightened, everyone moved faster. Extra polish on the wine glasses, fresh folds on the linen, whispered warnings not to make mistakes around important guests. Important never meant people like Alana. The manager quietly shifted the floor plan, assigning the wealthiest tables to the most presentable servers. Alana watched as lighter-skinned staff were moved to the front, while she and the busboys were pushed to the edges. It was subtle, unspoken, but familiar. She had seen the same thing in hospitals when certain patients were saved for white nurses, who seemed to make them feel safer. Then she heard the name. It rolled off the manager's tongue with rehearsed respect. The name of the billionaire whose company had swallowed her hospital and then gutted it. In an instant, she was back in that fluorescent-lit room, holding the layoff letter in trembling hands. His printed signature anchored at the bottom like a stamp of finality. Now he was here, in her section, because a last-minute shuffle had left no one else free. She felt her stomach tighten as she approached his table. He sat like he owned not just the restaurant, but the air itself. Expensive suit, expensive watch, expensive boredom. He scrolled on his phone while staff hovered, terrified of displeasing him. To him, Alana was just another black woman in an apron, someone meant to move quietly and disappear. He never looked at her face. He inspected the table instead, hunting for imperfections that could be blamed on someone beneath him. A slightly crooked fork, a water glass with a faint fingerprint, a plate delivered seconds later than he wanted. Each detail became another excuse for him to question her competence. Alana recognized the tone even without looking directly at him. It was the same tone she had heard in family members who doubted she was really the nurse, in supervisors who overchecked her charts, in patients who asked if there was a real nurse available. The words changed, but the message stayed the same. Someone like her was always on trial. When the kitchen ran behind on an appetizer, the billionaire seized his moment. His irritation blossomed into performance. He raised his voice just enough for surrounding tables to hear. He did not mention her name, but he focused every complaint on her presence, her slowness, her supposed lack of training. The question of why establishments like this no longer seemed to care about qualified staff. The words were coded in politeness but carried something sharper underneath. Alana felt it land on her skin like acid. She saw the manager's face pale, not from concern for her, but from fear of losing a wealthy client. The apology went one way, toward the man with the money. Within minutes, Alana was quietly removed from the table. The manager avoided her eyes as he reassigned the billionaire to a white server with less experience and fewer skills. The message was clear. Her presence was the problem, not his prejudice. Alana returned to the shadows of the dining room, carrying trays for other people, swallowing the humiliation that rose like bile in her throat. But the same people who had sidelined her still depended on her competence. When a nervous busser knocked vintage wine across the billionaire's table, panic erupted. No one knew how to fix it without making things worse. Then all eyes turned to Alana. She stepped back into the circle of light, steady hands moving with practiced calm clearing, replacing, resetting, all without disturbing the billionaire's expensive watch or the fragile ego attached to it. As she leaned over, the thin gold chain at her neck swung forward, catching the light. For the first time that night, the billionaire's eyes lifted to her, then dropped to the necklace. His gaze locked on the letters of her name. His expression shifted, first confusion, then recognition, then something darker. It was the look of a man who had seen that name before. Somewhere it did not belong. And suddenly, he was no longer bored. For a moment, the dining room noise faded to a dull hum. His eyes stayed fixed on the small gold letters resting against her uniform. Alana, her last name. He repeated it slowly in his head, and something shifted behind his expression a search, a memory surfacing from a place he rarely visited. He leaned back slightly, as if seeing her for the first time, not as a server, as a problem he thought he had already buried. Minutes later, the manager rushed to her side, panic in every movement. Without explanation, Alana was led past the clinking glasses and forced smiles through the swinging kitchen door, down the narrow hallway that smelled of bleach and old carpet. At the end of it, the billionaire waited in the small office usually reserved for employee write-ups and scheduled disputes. He stood there like he owned the walls and the air, framed by security cameras and stacks of menus. The manager hovered near the door, ready to sacrifice her to keep the peace. Alana felt the weight of every bill she owed, every application she had submitted, every quiet way the world had reminded her that black women like her had less room to make mistakes. On the desk lay a printed page he had demanded. Her file, her full name, her old occupation, the hospital's name. His company's logo at the top of the layoff notice, his digital signature at the bottom. In an instant, all the separated pieces of her life collided in that cramped room. Her father waiting hours in an understaffed emergency room. Her overstretched unit, the frantic code that came too late. The bitter knowledge that his death had been labeled an unfortunate outcome instead of what it truly was, the cost of someone else's profit. That same profit now stood inches away, wrapped in designer fabric, watching her like she was an inconvenience he wished would disappear. He had once dismissed her in an email as a disgruntled former employee when she joined a complaint about dangerous cuts in black neighborhoods. Now he was trapped in a room with the living proof that his decisions had faces, families, funerals. Their eyes met. For the first time, Alana saw fear on his, not fear of her, but fear of what she represented, the possibility that one of the people he had written off as collateral damage was no longer willing to stay silent. In that split second, with her past spread across the desk and her future hanging by a thread, she understood something clearly. This was not just about a rude customer or a bad shift. This was the moment she decided whether to remain invisible, or to make sure he never forgot her name again. She did not raise her voice. She did not beg. Standing in that cramped office under the glow of a buzzing fluorescent light, Alana simply began to speak. She laid out the timeline he had hoped would stay buried. The merger that targeted hospitals in black neighborhoods, the staff cuts that stripped resources from already fragile communities, the night her father waited on a hard plastic chair while an understaffed team fought to keep too many people alive with too little help. She described how his death had been folded into a spreadsheet and smoothed over as an acceptable loss. The billionaire listened, arms crossed at first, trying to hold on to the distance he always had. But the distance kept shrinking. This was not a line item or a legal risk. This was his signature on a letter that stole a daughter's career and a father's chance to live. On the other side of the door, staff paused, pretending to wipe counters and stack menus while they strained to hear. They had watched him humiliate her. Now they watched her refuse to disappear. By the time she finished, the manager's face held a new kind of fear, not just fear of losing a rich customer, but fear that the story leaving that room would be bigger than any tip he could leave. Alana walked out with no guarantee her job was safe. But she walked out with something he could never again take from her: the knowledge that she had named what he had done, out loud, to his face. Days later, her account of that night, her layoff, her father. The cuts that hit black patients and black workers first circulated online and reached people already fighting the same machine. His name was suddenly trending beside words he could not control. Did it undo the harm? No. Her father was still gone. Her unit was still closed. But the illusion that these decisions were harmless, neutral, colorblind, that shattered. Because this is how racism often works now. Not just in slurs and open hatred, but in polished boardrooms and restructuring plans that quietly decide whose lives are worth protecting. So when someone like him looks at a black woman and calls her unqualified, what are they really saying? And when you see it happen, at a table, in a workplace, in your own community, will you stay silent? Or will you make sure their names are never forgotten?